Richard Dawkins, The Greatest Show on Earth, The Evidence for Evolution. Dogs again. Having finally reached the topic of natural selection, we can turn back to the example of dogs for some other important lesson. I said that they are domesticated wolves, but I needed to qualify this in the light of a fascinating theory of the evolution of the dog, which has again been most clearly articulated by Raymond Coffinger. The idea is that the evolution of the dog was not just a matter of artificial selection. It was at least as much a case of wolves adapting to the ways of man by natural selection. Much of the initial domestication of dogs was self-domestication, mediated by natural, not artificial selection. Long before we got our hands on the chisel in the artificial selection toolbox, natural selection had already sculpted wolves into self-domesticated village dogs without any human intervention. Only later did human adopt these village dogs and transmogrify them separately and comprehensively into the rainbow spectrum of breed to today grace, if grace is the word, crops, and similar pageant for canine achievement and beauty, if beauty is the word. Coffinger point out that when domestic animals break free and go feral for many generations, they usually revert to something close to their wild ancestor. They might expect feral dogs, therefore, to become rather wolf-like. But this doesn't happen. Instead, dogs left to go feral seem to become the ubiquitous village dogs, pie dogs, that hang around human settlement all over the third world. This encouraged Corporal's belief that the dog on which human breeders finally went to work were wolves no longer. They had already changed themselves into dogs, village dog, pie dog, perhaps dingoes. Real wolves are pack hunters. Village dogs are scavengers that frequent midland and rubbish dump. Wolves scavenge too, but they not temperamentally suited to scavenging human rubbish because of their long flight distance. If you see an animal feeding, you can measure its flight distance by seeing how close it will let you approach before bleeding. For any given species in any given situation, there will be an optimal flight distance, somewhere between two risks or foolhardy at the short hand, and two flight or risk average at the long end. Individuals that take off too late when danger threatens are more likely to be killed by the very danger. Less obviously, there is such a thing to take off too soon. Individuals that are too flighty never get a square meal because they run away at the first hint of danger on the horizon. It's easy for us to overlook the danger of being too risk-averse. We are puzzled when we see zebras and antelope calmly grazing in full view of a lion, keeping on no more than a wary eye of them. Why? We are puzzled because our own risk aversion or that of our safari guide keeps us firmly inside the Land Rover, even though we had no reason to think there is a lion within miles. This is because we have nothing to set against our fear. We are going to get our square meals back at the safari lodge. Our wild ancestors would have had much more sympathy with the risk-taking zebras. Like the zebras, They had to balance the risk of being eaten against the risk of not eating. Sure, the lion might attack, but depending on the size of your troop, the odds were that it would catch another member of it rather than you. And if you never ventured on to the feeding grounds or down to the waterhole, you'd die anyway of hunger or thirsty. It's the same lesson of economic trade-off that we have already met twice. The bottom line of the digression is that the wild wolf, like any other animal, will have an optimal flight distance, nicely poised and potentially flexible between too bold and too flighty. Natural selection will work on the flight distance, moving it one way or the other along the continuum if conditions change over evolutionary time. If a plantainous new food source in the form of village rubbish dumps enters the world of the wolf, that is going to shape the optimum point toward the shorter end of the flight distance continuum, in the direction of reluctance to flee when enjoying this new bounty. We can imagine wild wolves scavenging on the rubbish tip on the edge of the village. Most of them, fear of the man throwing stone and spears, have a very long flight distance. There, they sprint for the safety of the forest as soon as human appears in the distance. But a few individuals, by genetic chance, happen to have a slightly shorter flight distance in the average. Their readiness to take a slight risk. They are brave, shall we say, not but foolhardy, gain them more food than their more risk-averse rivals. As the generations go by, natural selection favors a shorter and shorter flight distance until just before it reaches the point where the wolves really are endangered by stone-throwing humans. The optimum flight distance has shifted because of the newly available food source. Something like this evolutionary shortening of the flight distance was the Coffinger's view. The first step of demonstration of the dog is achieved by natural selection, not artificial selection. Decreasing flight distance is a behavioral measure of what might be called increasing tameness. In this stage in the process, humans were not deliberately choosing the tamest individual for breeding. At this early stage, the only interaction between human and these incipient dogs were hostile. If wolves were becoming domesticated, it was by self-domestication, not deliberate domestication by people. Deliberate domestication came later. You can get an idea of how tameness or anything else can be sculpted naturally or artificially by looking at a fascinating experiment of modern times on the domestication of Russian silverfox for use in the fur trade. It's doubly interesting because of the lesson it teaches us over and over about I knew about the domestication process, about the side effects of selective breeding, and about the resemblance, which Diane will understand, between artificial and natural selection. The silver fox is just a color variant, barely for its beautiful fur, of the familiar red fox, Bulbous bulbous. The Russian geneticist Dmitry Belayev was employed to run a fox farm in the 1950s. He was later sacked because his scientific genetics conflict with the anti-scientific ideology of Lysenko, the charlatan biologist who managed to capture the ear of Stalin and so take over and largely ruin of all Soviet genetics and agriculture for some 20 years. Bielav retained his love of fox and of true Ryzhenkov pre-genetics, and he was later able to resume his studies of both as a director of an Institute of Genetics in Siberia. While the foxes are tricky to handle, Belax set out deliberately to breed for tameness. Like any other animal or plant breeder of his time, his method was to exploit natural selection, natural variation, no genetic engineering in those days, and choose for breeding those males and females came close to the ideal he was seeking. And selecting for tameness, Balaab could have chosen for breeding those dogs and bitches most appeal to him, or look at him is the cutest facial expression. Those might well have had the desired effect on the tameness of future generations. More systematically than that, however, he used to measure he was pretty close to the flight distance. I was mentioned the connection with wild wolves, but adapted for cubs. Beliab and his colleagues and successor for an experimental program continued after his death, subjected Park's cubs to standardized tests in which an experimenter would operate cub food by hand, while trying to stroke or ponder it. The cubs were classified into three classes. Class 3 cubs were those that bled from or beat the person. Class 2 cubs would allow them to be handled but show no positive responsiveness to the experiment. Class 1 cubs, the tamest of all, positively approached the handler, wagging their tail and whining. When the cubs grew up, the experiment systematically bred only from this tamest class. After a mere 6th generation of his selective breeding for tameness, Parks had exchanged so much that the experiment felt obliged to name a new category, the domesticated elite class, which were eager to establish human contact, whimpering to attract attention and sniffing and licking experiments like dogs. At the beginning of the experiment, none of the pugs were in the elite class. After 10 generations of breeding for tameness, 18% were elite. After 20 generations, 35%. And after 30 to 35 generations, domesticated elite individuals constitute between 70 and 80% of the experimental population. Such results are perhaps not too surprising, except for the astonishing magnitude and speed of the effect. 35 generations would pass unnoticed on the geological timescale. Even more interesting, however, were the unexpected side effects of the selective breeding for tameness. These were truly fascinating and genuinely unforeseen. Darwin, the dog lover, would have been entranced. Believe with his bugs as they turned tame and dog-like. The tame fox not only behaved like domestic dogs, they looked like them. They lost their foxy flesh and became piebald black and white, like wealthy collies. Their foxy prick ears were replaced by doggy fluffy ears. Their tail turned up at the end like a dog, rather than down like a fox brush. The female came on heat every 6 months like a bitch, instead of every year like a bison. According to Belev, they even sound like a dog. These dog-like features were side effects. Belev and his team did not deliberately breed for them, only for tameness. Those are the dog-like characteristics seemingly rode on the evolutionary coattails of the genes for tameness. To geneticists, this is not surprising. They recognize a widespread phenomenon called pleiotrophy, whereby goons have more than one effect, seemingly unconnected. The stress is on the word seemingly. Embryonic development is a complicated business. As we learn more about the details, the seemingly unconnected turn into connected by a route that we now understand, but didn't before. Presumably, genes for floppy ears and piebald coat are preadolescently linked in genes for tameness in pugs as well as in dogs. They illustrate the generally important point about evolution. About to notice a characteristic of an animal and ask what its Darwinian survival value is, you may be asking the wrong question. It could be that the characteristic you have picked out is not the one that matters. It may have come along for the ride, dragged along in evolution by some other characteristic to which it's preatrobacally linked. The evolution of the dog, then, if Coppinger is right, was not just a matter of artificial selection, but a completed mixture of natural selection, which predominated in the early stage of domestication, and artificial selection, which came to unfold more recently. The transition would have been seamless, which again go to emphasize is similarity, as Darwin recognized between artificial and natural selection.